Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to my Canada or Gilles-Villeneuce post-race reaction. What was your thoughts on this race? Did it live up to expectations? Did it exceed your expectations, or did it fall short? I thought it was a really good one. I liked it a lot. I thought it had actions in the pits that kind of gave you that pit strategy implementation that kind of gave you some overtakes on the pits, or potentially not, and it gave on track action with passes and issues on track between that wet line and that dry line. And with that drying track throughout the thing, we had different strategies from the beginning as well. So I thought this was almost a perfect race. I'd probably give it a 9 out of 10. But what was your thoughts on this race? What would you rate it? Would you rate it high? Would you rate it low? I really loved it, but I would love to hear your opinion as well. And to go through my normal stint, I go from the last driver on that finished the finish line and up to the first to try to give you my thoughts on how they did and what I thought of their driving, if I know, and potentially what happened to them if I know what happened to them in their race. So without further ado, let us go over to Logan Sargent, who really struggled this whole weekend. He ended up getting up into 13th for qualifying over that starting position, but really was still struggling. He spun already twice in the race, and that second spin kind of put him into the wall where he could not recover from, and so he ended up having to do a DNF. Now I have him actually passing Ocon on lap 15 lap 5 for position 15. And that was a good start in the sense that he was doing a fairly decent job on track in this action, not really just tagging along in the back, but actually doing some passing and some other work involved. Even though he did have that off early on that he was able to recover from. And then, of course, he went off in turn 4, which caused the first safety car. And that was kind of where some of the triggering action happened for some of the rest of the field. Now, so I can't really say that he did a great job. He's getting better, and he did a little bit better in that qualifying session that kind of pushed him up in that grid, which is always good to see. He just didn't quite follow through in the race with these wet conditions. He was really struggling on that line, basically, to see if he could do anything with it once he got into that position. So, for my view, he still has a lot of work to do, and unfortunately, I think he's going to be let go at the end of the season. They're going to have someone else in that Williams seat. Now, Charles Leclerc had engine troubles at the very beginning of the race, and that just led to doing weird strategies and ended up just deciding to call that and just pull that car into the pits. And they're going to have to try to really figure out what's going on with that engine and those modes that they put him in to get the best out of that, because it sounded like once they came in and he ended up losing the engine and they restarted it, that cleared it out for a little while. But at that point, their race was gone, and they were kind of betting on the slick tires before that was really ready for those slick tires. And that just put them farther and farther behind. And so that's why they basically decided to just drop out of this race at that point in time. He did gain one position on the start of the race, so that was a good plus. And he did pass Hulkenberg on lap 13 for 9th. But since then, he kind of just dropped back down the grid. He had like 4 pit stops where he ended up deciding to just call it for good. And he said they gambled, on those hard tires to start off with and had to switch back to intermediates. And that didn't help them at all in that running. So a really horrible race for Charles, and I think he's ready to forget this race. Not necessarily that they need to make a lot of changes from what his interview said for the next race, but just that they get some things right and things wrong, and they need to learn from those and just kind of push forward in that Ferrari to get better strategies and better placements for those cars during the qualifying, and then get them up to speed in the race. Now, Sergio Perez had a horrible weekend as well, qualifying in 16th, so quite a bit down from his teammate. And then he ended up going and spinning, catching that curb a little bit too much, I think, and then it kind of caught him off guard into that wet, spinning him around and hitting the rear of his Red Bull into the wall, super damaging that rear wing was almost falling off. And actually didn't even hear if they were going to penalize him anymore because of driving around with a unsafe car or not. But he ended up basically making it back to the pits and pulling that Red Bull in and just retiring the car at that point in time. He did lose a position on the start of the race. He had a little bit of contact with Gasly at the start of the race that had some front wing damage, so he lost that front wing end plate. And that may have caused some of that issues that he had later on, but in this regard, I think he was just really struggling in these conditions, and because it was really wet and dry, intermixed between drying and getting wetter, and so that really played havoc on his mind and wasn't able to get everything he needed in this race. Hopefully, with that 2-year extension that he just was announced with Red Bull, that he can actually live up to that, because I know this race will probably put some doubts in some people's heads on whether that was a wise move for Red Bull to sign that contract or not. Then we have Alex Albon, who was kind of caught with Sainz when Sainz spun. So it wasn't any fault of his own that he got knocked out of the race, because he got caught and just kind of slammed into the wall from Sainz in that incident that ended up damaging the Williams beyond where he could actually do anything with it. And so that caused, I think that was the big second safety car issue that occurred, was all of that going on and him having to recover that vehicle off the track. I have him basically losing 2 positions at the start, but then he started gaining some of those back slowly. He did pass Tsunoda on lap, I don't remember what lap it was for 11th, and then he passed Leclerc on lap 21 and passed Ricciardo on lap 31 as for 9th. So he was making his progress and doing a fairly decent job trying to get the edge of those points to try to get that point range for that Williams after his teammate had kind of got knocked out. In fact, he had a really good pass where he went from the outside and had to duck into the inside, and had a really good pass over 2 vehicles at the same time during that incident. And so it was a really good run for him until he just caught up, no fault of his own, by Sainz, spinning and catching the back of his car into the wall. So I liked what Albon was doing, even in that Williams, trying to get them back into the points to try to get them a little bit farther up in the constructors' standings. So a really good job for him. Carlos, it was like the other Ferrari. They were kind of really struggling this weekend. Didn't have a whole lot going on. He did pass Sargent for 14th on lap 4. He had some damage from Bottas where he kind of collided with him. And then he was getting around fairly well, and then until he had that spin on basically where he ended up just caught a little bit extra, losing it, spun around, collided with Albon, and then he got shot off into the grass, and then spun around in the grass, eventually got back on, and I think that they were just decided there was too much damage for that Ferrari. I didn't hear exactly what damage that was, but he pulled into the pits and basically they retired it on the spot. So there must have been some kind of suspension or some other damage to that Ferrari, causing a double DNF for Ferrari, which is not very good for them in the sense that they were trying to push on, the Red Bulls in that constructor's standing point, and this will be a big setback for them in that regards. So that kind of gives you the bottom 4, 5 people that basically were just having horrible days or got caught out by other people that were having horrible days in that regard. And then the person that actually made it the whole track, a whole race distance, was Juan Zhou, who was a lap down and didn't really get going. I think he was 2 laps down at one point and was until that second safety car hit, and then he was able to make up a lap due to that. But he was never really gained any grounds on that and was really struggling, even though he started from the pits and with a different setup to hopefully give them a little bit better regards on that stake kick Sauber F1. But really could never get anything going. So in that regard, it was a very bad day for Juan Zhou, especially once he was trying to show that he is really good and needs a seat for next year as well. So Yuki was actually doing fairly good. He qualified in 8th, but then was going long on a set of intermediates and then just lost it and got shoved back out of the points. So he was doing a fairly good job. He did pass Leclerc for 10th on lap 22. Finally switched to some mediums on lap 45. But was kind of like in that regard, was just pushing it fairly strong, never getting it quite where he needed to. And then at the end of that stint, just kind of like lost it and dropped back out of the point range and never could quite recover to that point variant. So sad day for Yuki because he was actually looking fairly good, fairly strong throughout this whole weekend. Qualifying in 8th is always good in that sense. And then he just had that one mistake that kind of caused him issues and that dropped him back out of the points in that setting. So I'm not sure if that was just a rookie mistake or if that was just any mistake that because of the conditions, if you get off that grid, that line, it really hinders your car. And I think that's what it was. It's just the tiredness, the fatigue of going around the circuit in these conditions just played havoc on Yuki. And at the end, he just made that small mistake and that cost him that running. So I think he was doing a really good job. I think he'll learn from it. I think he'll get him motivated for the future. So I think he's in a good position, even though he got dropped out of the points. Valtteri ended up starting the race in 19th position after starting from the pits. Kind of with his teammate, they kind of made some changes, so they started back in the back of the pack. He ended up able to work up to 13th position. I know he went fairly long on that first intermediate tires, I think all the way up to 43 before switching to some medium tires. And then in that stint, couldn't quite get it back to where he needed to be in that regard. And the Haas's right ahead of him were basically had gambled and had done a couple of different pit stop strategies. So they were pushed close to him, but he couldn't quite do anything with that to overtake them to get closer to that point scheme. So Stake F1 has a lot of work to be done still. They're still the slowest car, I think, on the grid, and they need to get some changes to that before Audi comes in to really kind of get going and get pushing like the rest of the teams are, as they're kind of lagging behind in that regard. Their updates haven't quite worked out as well as they were hoping to, so hopefully they can bring something future. I was hoping that this might be a good opportunity for them since it was kind of these wet conditions and it kind of levels the playing field, and I know Valtteri kind of likes those conditions to start off with, so that helped him a little bit, but not enough to get into the point standings. So a decent run from him, but not quite where he needed to be. Kind of my viewpoint, for him is that he was good, but not quite good enough to get into that point range with that lagging kick Sauber that they have, and they haven't been able to really get the updates that they really need to get that more competitive this year. So hopefully they can still bring those in later this year to try to help develop them towards that Audi. When Audi takes over, that they'll be closer to that front running spot. Now we come to Haas, who came in 11th and 12th. K-Mag actually was doing awesome. He had, even though he started off in 14th, he was all the way up to 4th at one point early on in the race when they basically started off on wets for the Haas's, where everybody else was on intermediates, which gave them the super high boost at the very beginning where they were able to have that traction where other people weren't, and it rained a little bit longer than most of the teams were thinking it was going to be. So that kind of gave him that extra bump. And unfortunately for Kevin, or K-Mag, they had that when they brought him in. I said, okay, your wet tires are running out. We're going to bring you in for a pit stop. They called him in, and for some reason the team wasn't quite ready for him to come in, and so they had to wait around a little bit longer than he should have to get those tires changed, which basically killed all of the progress and the gamble that they did to start off on wet tires. And so that was very disappointing for me for those Haas. It was awesome to see them, running up through the fields, passing cars left and right at the beginning of this GP, which seems so long ago after you kind of hit those marks. But because he was all the way up there, close to podium positions, and I think he probably wouldn't gotten up to that far, but if he had been able to switch to intermediates on a clean pit stop, I think he would have been in those point ranges for, 8th or the 10th range, which would have been a really big boost for Kevin after he's had so many points for collisions and other controversies on his racing style for the last couple of races. So that would have been a really big boost. And then they had this other kind of basically huge mistake on their part, not getting those tires ready, having that really long pit stop it caused him to drop back into the back of the pack. Then he had to kind of play around with those, and so he ended up having 4 pit stops altogether, and kind of working his way into that realm. He did pass Hamilton on lap 2 for 6th, and then on lap 3, he passed Oscar Piastri for 4th, and so that kind of gave you that inference, from this, Kevin Magnussen, making those moves, making those passes when he had the grip, and then later on he passed Bottas in that running when he kind of got back into that run. So he had some action, and a lot more action that I probably didn't record because there's action everywhere. It's hard for me to get those bits and pieces during this race because there was so much going on, which I loved, but it makes it harder for me to give it to you guys. Hulkenberg was not quite as aggressive as K-Mag and started a little bit farther back in 17th, but did make his way all the way up to 11th, just outside of points again. So that's a good running for Hulkenberg in this spot. I had him passing Leclerc on lap 3 for 10th, passing Stroll on lap getting up to 9th on lap 3, and then kind of staggering around there, and then passing Juan Zhou on lap 38th for 17th, and then kind of you can see he worked his way back up to 11th, and all of the turmoil and all the pit stop strategies that he and the other teams ran through. So a good run for Nico Hulkenberg, not quite where he wanted to be into those points again, but still a good run for them. I think it's a good positive, even though their strategy kind of backfired in the sense that they weren't quite ready for that pit stop for K-Mag, but a good run for both of them in this weird scenario of, wet roads, drying, and then getting a little bit wet again, and then drying out at the end of the race, getting back onto those slick tires. And that brings us to the front of the grid, where we have both Alpines, which is awesome to see. I know Esteban Ocon was kind of disappointed in this. He did start off in 18th, even though basically he qualified at the end because of the issues from last week, where he had that grid penalties, with the collisions. And so he was basically supposed to start at the back, but since the Stake F1s decided to start from the pits, he started at an 18th position, worked his all the way back up into points, and was actually in ninth position. And they had them switch positions because they were trying to get Gasly to see if he could actually put pressure on Daniel, which didn't happen. And I know he was kind of upset about that, saying he was playing the team game, even though it wasn't really worth anything at that point, because there was, in his view, there was no way they were going to catch Daniel for that eighth position. And so he was just basically treating himself as like he lost a point for that, dropping back to 10th instead of being in that ninth position. But still, it's a double points for Alpine, which is good to see from where we saw them at the very beginning of the season, where they were the actual worst team on the grid. And now they're basically starting to work their way back into that midfield, getting those points and trying to start putting pressure on, RB potentially, or Haas, and more likely in scenarios for those constructors' points. But again, Gasly is doing a decent job. He did lose 3 positions at the beginning of the race, but was able to pull those back. I have him passing Perez having that contact with Perez at the start, passing K-Mag on lap 31 for 14th, and passing Ocon on lap 70, he said, for that 9th position. So I think that was more of a swap. I didn't hear the radios, but that's what it sounded like from Ocon's interview. That was more of a swap. So him getting up to the 9th was still a good sign. Gives him good vibes for next week, or the following race in this, coming back stronger, getting some points, getting back into that rhythm where he kind of starts building himself up, and I think that'll help him a lot as a driver. And then speaking of building yourself up, I think it was really good to see Daniel, even though he went backwards from his 5th starting position down to 8th. Him getting points is always good for RB as well. And since Yuki kind of knocked himself out of this race on that point standings, getting points for this race by that spin, it was good for RB to have that 8th position for Daniel Ricciardo. He was another one of these that kind of was in there struggling, and he ended up getting actually a 5-second penalty for a false start, which was really kind of iffy on my view from that replay. If that's what it was, he was gaining a little bit, but not really a total advantage, I thought. So by the strict rules, yes, but what we've seen in the past from some other people, it was really harsh. Hopefully this is the new standard, though, in the sense that you can't have any movement whatsoever on the start, and so it makes it a lot more clear on when there is a false start. But he did pass Hulkenberg on lap 12 for 7th, and was able to kind of keep it in there. He did lose 2 spots at the beginning of the race, which didn't help him in regards to this positioning, but was still a decent run for Daniel. Hopefully he can use this as a stepping stool to keep going. Otherwise, he will be out of that seat for RB in that regard. So we know that Yuki has signed a contract, which kind of blows my predictions out of the water for where Yuki and some of these other drivers are going to end up now. And I'll have to revisit my driver lineup later. But we'll have to see if Daniel can keep his seat at RB, or if they'll bring in, someone else into that seat. Lance Stroll, I didn't hear a whole lot from him, but did a decent job starting the qualifying in 9th and ended up in 7th. Decent run. I know he passed Hulkenberg on lap 12 for 8th position, and then was able to kind of work his way, keeping him fairly good. He went 26 laps on intermediates, and then I think he switched on lap 45 for another set of slicks. So he kind of went one of these that kind of did a double stint on intermediates before getting that slick tire, but did a really good job. I think just hitting those positions fairly right, keeping out of trouble, doing a good job for Aston Martin, getting points for Aston Martin, which is good to see because we haven't seen double points for Aston Martin in a while. And overall, his up and down, struggles are doing okay. I think hopefully he can level that out and be more competitive along with his teammate Fernando, kind of keeping those together, which would help them in the race. Fernando qualified in sixth and ended up in sixth. He had a kind of a quiet day as well. He did pass Ricardo for fifth. And I know there's some action probably for those Aston Martins that I didn't see or hear about, but a fairly good run for him. He did gain a position at the start of the race, which is good to see. Fernando, the wily Spaniard, making moves when he needs to. Ended up in that sixth position, which is another good point haul for Aston Martin in regards. Quite wasn't on par to get up to Oscar's pace. But overall, I think it's a good step for Aston Martin to get closer to those front runner in this regard. So hopefully that'll help them out in the next race, and they can kind of build upon this double point that they have and get a little bit more competitive, a little bit more pressure on the front runners. Oscar had a decent day. I think he was kind of struggling a little bit in regard, and I think he was frustrated with himself in certain aspects of this, but I think he did a decent job. Qualified in fourth, only dropped down to fifth overall. I know he has had some good fights with George at the end, kind of putting wheel to wheel around those corners that basically allowed Lewis basically to gain those ground on them because of getting off track, losing the momentum that they had, fighting each other, where Lewis was able to get ahead of George at one point, and then George was able to retake that position, but it was a loss for Oscar as he was running in third at one point. But I think it was still a decent job for him, even though it doesn't quite look that way on paper. I think it's a good learning experience. He's still pretty much a rookie in regards to a lot of things. I know it's more than not really a rookie year for him, but you kind of treat him as that regard, not quite the learned driver that some of the other drivers are around him that are fighting like Lewis Hamilton are. They've had that experience. So the grouping that he has around him are really good. And it's a really good showing, I think, for his future. So I think it was a really good run for him. And Lewis Hamilton, even though he said it was one of his worst drives ever, I think it was a good run for him. I don't know why he thought that. He did get the fastest lap. He did pass Daniel Ricciardo on lap 1 for sixth. He passed Russell on lap 64 for fourth. And he passed Oscar on lap 66 for third, and then he kind of got shifted back a little bit. But overall, I think it was a decent run for him, even though he didn't, get up high enough in the qualifying as he was hoping he would be. But I think it's still a good positive for Lewis Hamilton. I think it's, him pushing forward, giving it all. And so I think, even though he didn't like it, I thought it was a really good run for him in this race. George Russell, again, was a good race for him. Even though he got shoved back, I think it's a good sign for Mercedes that they got on the podium. It's their first podium of the season. They've made their progress, and they're still going to make progress in the later races. So I think they're going to get more competitive as that comes along and get to that data that they need to make those changes and verify that the changes that they've done are the positive ones that they have. He did keep the lead in the very start of the race, but then during this race, he kind of was able to get pulled back into the fray, and then through the pit stop strategies, was having to try to go back and retake some positions. So their strategy may not have been the best. It may have been okay. It's hard to gauge, truly, on my viewpoint. I know at the end they basically pitted again to get some more fresher mediums, which then looked like it was a good run because they were pushing back through. But then had some incidences that kind of lagged them behind where they weren't quite competitive enough to get to Max. But I think from those mistakes that George has had in that corner a couple of times in this race, he'll learn from that and be able to push forward and really push on himself. I think it was a good run. I think he was really disappointed in it, but I think it was a good run for him. He did pass Norris on lap 50 for 7th, Oscar on lap 67th for 4th, Hamilton on lap 69 for 3rd. So he did some good passing. He did some good wheel-to-wheel action with Oscar and Hamilton at the end, really pushing themselves, keeping it clean, but doing some really good entertainment, competitive passes on track for us as fans. So I really enjoyed his run. I know he wasn't really happy with it. Being on pole and dropping all the way back to 3rd is hard, but I think for Mercedes, that is a big step forward. And I think that they will actually make some further improvements as the season goes on. So they'll hopefully be more competitive with those top running, and we'll get some more action like we did today. Then we have Lando, who is, I think he went a little bit long on those intermediate tires when Max pitted. But overall, I think he did a really good job. He did qualify in 3rd, ended up in 2nd. He did pass Max on lap 21 for 2nd, and then he passed Russell on lap 22 for that 1st position. So he got himself in the lead, was making some good gap, and he was had some bad luck with the safety car that hit at the wrong time. So it pushed him back behind Max and George because of the pit stop that they end up needing to do because trying to get off those old sets of intermediates, even though there was some debate about that. But then trying to come back and fight through, then switching back to a set of mediums. And that was the big dilemma, I think, is when to switch those mediums. When Max was going and warming those mediums up, he looked like he was doing the right thing for that 1st lap, but then I think that he should have pitted after that 1st lap instead of going that 2nd lap when he was on those used intermediates and Max was on those fresh mediums. I think that might have given him a little bit of edge that he needed, but it's hard to see. And of course, 2020 rear vision is always better than forward vision. So I think that McLaren did a really good job in this run. And I think Lando, and I think he said it himself, he probably did as best as he could, getting good points for Lando. I know there was some debate, too, about him potentially being able to slow down, as at that point in time, I don't think we're going to be close to Max at the win. So it might have been better for him to keep Oscar Piastri in that DRS zone to help defend against George and Lewis. But again, that's hard to say if that would have happened and maybe have compromised his runs and made him vulnerable as well. So there is that. And then we have Max Verstappen, the winner of this race, who started off in 2nd. I don't have actually a whole lot for him, but he was doing a really good job and actually got the driver of the day, which is unusual for Max, as he's been so dominant that they kind of shy away from giving the driver of the day to him. But since he came in and was overtaken on track and came back even after that through some strategy into that 1st position and won it fairly easily at the end, it was a good run, and I think he did an excellent job. I have him basically passing Russell on lap 22 for 2nd, and he did go off on one of the corners that kind of, at the beginning of the race, slight mistake for him, and that as he was putting pressure on George, that kind of dropped him back into the clutches of Lando because of that gap that he was running, and kind of went off slightly to kept the position, but kind of had that issue. So it wasn't a perfect race for Max Verstappen by any means, and I think that's what helped the fans appreciate his run as he was overcoming all these obstacles in this race. So to give a quick rundown on lap 16, which is where I caught it, was Russell had a 0.67 second lead. And then on lap 25, it was Norris that was in the lead by 6.84 seconds. And then lap 35, Max was ahead by 1.5 seconds. And he was able to, on lap 50, be ahead by 4.3. And at the end of the race, he was down to a 3.7 second lead over Lando. So I know there was some switching on that second position during those leads, and a couple of lead changes at the very beginning of this that kind of gave it the really exciting time and the drill that we always want to see in a Formula One race. So I think this overall race was really good. I think most of the drivers did good at the top of the field, trying to work their way through. Some of the people at the end with the DNFs kind of caused them themselves, I think, with those small mistakes, getting off in that wet track, not expecting to be then kind of spinning or getting out of control a little bit more, causing some issues besides Charles Leclerc, who has had that engine issue. And then, of course, Alex Albon, who kind of got in some collateral damage through signs. But again, what was your thoughts of the race? Did you have a different driver of the day than Max? I could see potentially Russell being one of the drivers of the day, as he was able to, put some pressure on some things, even though it doesn't look real good. And since he was in pole and dropping down to third, and then I could see some other people having a good, strong running, and so giving those people an option for that. But overall, I do agree that Max is the driver of the day, being able to overcome all the obstacles, having a good run. I know he was complaining about his car throughout this race, so even though it wasn't the perfect car, he still was able to put everything together and pull out a win. So excellent job for Max. And if you made it this far, I'd appreciate a like. And if you want to see more of this content, please subscribe. Now we'll get to the driver standings. So what changed in our driver standings? None of the top 10 really changed. We get some gaps that narrowed because of people being out. And in regards to that, the big ones there are Oscar gaining on Sergio Perez, George Russell kind of gained some up there, and Lando gaining ground on Charles Leclerc, and then of course Max is up there kind of running away with it. Now at the bottom part of the field, you have a couple of jumps. We have Daniel Ricciardo jumping up to 12th over Nico Hülkenberg and Oliver Behrman. And then we have Pierre Gasly jumping over Kevin Magnussen, Esteban Ocon, and Alex Albon, gaining those 3 points, pushing him up to that 15th position. So overall, it's pretty steady on the top. We still get a little bit of changes in the rear half of this driver standings. Hopefully, we'll get a little bit more action as the season progresses. And of course, we still have Logan and Bottas and Juan Yuzo without points. And for the constructor standings, what do we see? Basically, Alpine jumping Williams because of the double DNF that Williams had this weekend, and Alpine having the double point in this regard kind of helps that Alpine jump over Williams, jumping up to the fifth 5 point over Williams 2. And again, we have Ferrari standing there where they were because of the double DNFs they had. So McLaren gaining ground on them, and then Mercedes, keeping up, and Aston Martin's doing a decent job getting double points, staying ahead of RB, and in that mix by themselves in that 5th position as well. So that's kind of what you see for the constructor standing. So what is coming up after this is the Spain or Catalunya GP on June 23rd. So we have a couple of weeks till then, and it has a length of 2.894 miles with a 66 laps being run for a total race distance of 190.908 miles. And it was first introduced in 1991, and Max Verstappen has the lap record holder in 2023 of 1 minute 16.33 seconds. And that concludes my reactions for the Canadian GP. And I'd appreciate a subscribe if you like this content, or a thumbs up to help the algorithm of the crazy Google, YouTube algorithms that who knows what they're trying to look for. And until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.